Hi. I'm back. I was quite depressed last week, so didn't really get anything done. It'd be really embarrassing if I work. I guess I have like 22 hours of me reading this book now, and then couldn't finish like 30 pages from the end of the book. But we'll get there. I was looking at Adorno's magnum opus, Negative Dialectics, which doesn't have a real translation into English. There's like a hypertext document, like an online bootleg translation, which is better than the only one. It's apparently better than the one printed translation. I was thinking about reading that next, maybe just go all out on Adorno. But I also wanted to read that Peter Berger book. Who knows? Maybe I'll stop doing this, since it is pretty ridiculous. Or maybe I'll just read something easier that I could actually comment on. Anyway. So we're going to pick up on page 320, finish the Paralipomena, go into Theories on the Origin of Art in the Excursus, try to get to page 340, which is into the draft introduction. All right. The thesis that the end of art is imminent or has already occurred recurs throughout history, and especially since the beginning of the modern age. Hegel reflects this thesis philosophically. He did not invent it. Though today it poses as being anti-ideological, it was until recently the ideology of historically decadent groups who took their own end to be the end of all things. The shift is probably marked by the communist ban on modern art, which suspended the imminent aesthetic movement in the name of social progress. The mentality of the apparatchiks, however, who thought this up, was the old petit bourgeois consciousness. Inevitably, the thesis of the end of art can be heard at dialectical nodal points where a new form suddenly emerges that is directed polemically against the established form. Since Hegel, the prophecy of the imminent end of art has more often been a component of a cultural philosophy that pronounces its judgment from on high than an element of actual artistic experience. In decrees, totalitarian measures were prepared. The situation has, however, always looked different from within art. The Beckettian zero point, the last straw for a howling philosophy of culture, is, like the atom, infinitely full. It is not inconceivable that humanity would no longer need a closed, imminent culture once it already had been realized. Today, however, the threat is a false destruction of culture, a vehicle of barbarism. The il faut continuer, the conclusion of Beckett's The Unnameable, condenses this antinomy to its essence, that externally art appears impossible while imminently it must be pursued. What is new is that art must incorporate its own decline. As the critique of the spirit of domination, it is the spirit that is able to turn against itself. The self-reflection of art penetrates to its own foundation and concretizes itself in it. The political significance, however, which the thesis of the end of art had 30 years ago, as for instance, indirectly in Benjamin's theory of reproduction, is gone. Incidentally, despite his desperate advocacy of mechanical reproduction, in conversation, Benjamin refused to reject contemporary painting. Its tradition, he argued, must be preserved for times less somber than our own. Nevertheless, in the face of the threatened transformation into barbarism, it is better for art to come to a silent halt rather than to desert to the enemy and aid a development that is tantamount to integration into the status quo for the sake of its superior power. The lie in the intellectuals' proclamation of the end of art resides in their question as to what the point is of art, what its legitimation is vis-a-vis contemporary praxis. But the function of art in the totally functional world is its functionlessness. It is pure superstition to believe that art could intervene directly or lead to an intervention. The instrumentalization of art sabotages its opposition to instrumentalization. Only where art respects its own immanence does it convict practical reason of its lack of reason. Art opposes the hopelessly antiquated principle of l'art pour l'art, not by ceding to external purposes, but by renouncing the illusion of a pure realm of beauty that quickly reveals itself as kitsch. By determinate negation, artworks absorb the membra disjecta of the empirical world and through their transformation organize them into a reality that is counter-reality, a monstrosity. This was Baudelaire's interpretation of the watchword of l'art pour l'art when he used it. Just how little this is the time for the abolition of art is apparent in its concretely open yet untried possibilities, which languish as if under a spell. Even when art in protest works itself free, it remains unfree, for even the protest is constrained. Clearly, it would be miserable apologetics to claim that the end of art cannot be envisioned. In response, art can do no better than close its eyes and grit its teeth. Sealing art off from empirical reality became an explicit program in Hermetic poetry. In the face of all of its important works, those of Celan, for instance, it is justified to ask to what extent they are indeed Hermetic. As Peter Zondi points out, they are self-contained. That they are self-contained does not mean that they are unintelligible. On the contrary, Hermetic poetry and social elements have a common nexus that must be acknowledged. Reified consciousness, which through the integration of highly industrialized society becomes integral to its members, fails to perceive what is essential to the poems, emphasizing instead their thematic content and putative informational value. Artistically, people can only be reached any longer by the shock that imparts a blow to what pseudoscientific ideology calls communication. For its part, art is integral only when it refuses to play along with communication. Hermetic procedures are, however, motivated by the growing pressure to separate the poetry from the thematic material and from the intentions. This pressure has extended from reflection to poetry, which seeks to take under its own auspices its raison d'être, and this effort is at the same time its imminent law of movement. Hermetic poetry, the idea of which originates in the period of Jugendstil and has something in common with the then prevalent concept of the will to style, can be seen as poetry that sets out to produce from itself what otherwise only emerges historically, its essential content. This effort has a chimerical aspect in that it requires the transformation of emphatic content into intention. Hermetic poetry makes thematic and treats explicitly what earlier in art occurred without its having been aimed at. To this extent, Valéry's idea of a reciprocal relation between artistic production and self-reflection in the course of poetic production is already formulated in Mallarmé. Out of his desire for a utopian art free of everything art alien, Mallarmé was apolitical and therefore extremely conservative. But by his rejection of the sort of unctuous message as preached by every conservative voice today, he converges with his political counterpole, Dadaism. In literary history, there is never a scarcity of intermediaries. In the more than 80 years since Mallarmé, Hermetic poetry has been transformed, partially in response to the social tendency. The cliché about the ivory tower no longer applies to the windowless monadic works. The beginnings were not free of the small-mindedness and desperate rapture of an art religion that convinced itself that the world was treated for the sake of a beautiful verse or a well-tuned phrase. In the work of the most important contemporary representative of German Hermetic poetry, Paul Celan, the experiential content of the Hermetic was inverted. His poetry is permeated by the shame of art in the face of suffering that escapes both experience and sublimation. Celan's poems want to speak of the most extreme horror through silence. The truth content itself becomes negative. They imitate a language beneath the helpless language of human beings, indeed beneath all organic language. It is that of the dead speaking of stones and stars. The last rudiments of the organic are liquidated. What Benjamin noted in Baudelaire, that his poetry is without aura, comes into its own in Celan's work. The infinite discretion with which his radicalism proceeds compounds his force. The language of the lifeless becomes the last possible comfort for a death that is deprived of all meaning. The passage into the inorganic is to be followed not only in thematic motifs, rather the trajectory from horror to silence is to be reconstructed in the Hermetic works. Distantly analogous to Kafka's treatment of expressionist painting, Celan transposes into linguistic processes the increasing abstraction of landscape, progressively approximating it to the inorganic. By appearing as art, that which insists that it is realistic injects meaning into reality, which such art is pledged to copy without illusion. In the face of reality, this is a priori ideological. Today, the impossibility of realism is not to be concluded on inner aesthetic grounds, but equally on the basis of the historical constellation of art and reality. Today, the primacy of the object and aesthetic realism are almost absolutely opposed to each other, and indeed, when measured by the standard of realism, Beckett is more realistic than the socialist realists who counterfeit reality by their very principle. If they took reality seriously enough, they would eventually realize what Lukács condemned when, during the days of his imprisonment in Romania, he is reported to have said that he had finally realized that Kafka was a realist writer. The primacy of the object is not to be confused with the various attempts to extract art from its subjective mediation and to siphon objectivity into it from the outer world. Art puts the prohibition on positive negation to the test, showing that indeed negation of the negative is not the positive, that it does not accomplish the reconciliation with an object that is unreconciled with itself. The thesis that the sum of taboos implies a canon of what is correct appears incompatible with the philosophical critique of the concept that the negation of the negation is a positive, a concept that both in theory and in the social practice it implies signifies the sabotage of the negative labor of understanding. In the idealist model of dialectics, this negative labor of understanding is transformed into an antithesis that is constrained by the fact that its critique is to serve the legitimation of the thesis at a higher level. Granted, in this regard, art and theory are not absolutely different. The moment idiosyncrasies, the aesthetic plenipotentiaries of negation, are raised to the level of positive rules. They freeze into anonymous abstractions vis-a-vis the particular artwork and artistic experience, and they mechanically subsume the interrelatedness of the artwork's elements at the expense of that interrelatedness. Through canonization, advanced artistic means easily acquire a restorative cast and become allied with structural elements against which the very same idiosyncrasies, themselves transformed into rules, once struggled. If, in art, everything is a question of nuance, this is no less true of the nuance between proscription and prescription. Speculative idealism, which culminated in Hegel's doctrine of positive negation, may have been borrowed from the idea of the absolute identity of artworks. Given their immanent economic principle and their artifactuality, artworks can in fact, in themselves, be much more consistent. and in the logical sense of the term more positive, than is theory, which is directly concerned with empirical reality. It is only through the progress of reflection that the principle of identity proves to be illusory, even in the artwork, because its other is constitutive of its autonomy. To this extent, artworks too are alien to positive negation. With regard to the aesthetic object, the thesis of the primacy of the object means the primacy of the object itself, the artwork, over its maker as well as over its recipients. As Schoenberg said, "After all, I paint a picture, not a chair." Through this immanent primacy, the primacy of the external world is aesthetically mediated. Unmediatedly, as the primacy of whatever the artwork presents, the primacy of the object would amount to the circumvention of the double character of the artwork. In the artwork, the concept of positive negation gains a new meaning. Aesthetically, it is possible to speak of such positivity to the extent that the canon of historically necessary prohibitions serves the primacy of the object, that is, its immanent coherence. Artworks present the contradictions as a whole, the antagonistic situation as a totality. Only by mediation, not by taking sides, are artworks capable of transcending the antagonistic situation through expression. The objective contradictions fissure the subject. They are not posited by the subject or the manufacturer of his consciousness. This is the true primacy of the object in the inner composition of artworks. The subject can be fruitfully extinguished into the aesthetic object only because the subject itself is mediated through the object and is simultaneously the suffering subject of expression. The antagonisms are articulated technically, that is, they are articulated in the immanent composition of the work, and it is this process of composition that makes interpretation permeable to the tensions external to it. The tensions are not copied, but rather form the work. This alone constitutes the aesthetic concept of form. Even in a legendary better future, art could not disavow remembrance of accumulated horror. Otherwise, its form would be trivial. Theories on the origin of art, excursus. The attempts to derive aesthetics from the origins of art as its essence are inevitably disappointing. If the concept of origin is situated beyond history, the question takes on an ontological cast far removed from that solid ground that the prestigious concept of origin evokes. Moreover, any invocation of the concept of origin that is divested of its temporal element transgresses against the simple meaning of the word, to which the philosophers of origin claim to be privy. Yet to reduce art historically to its prehistorical or early origins is prohibited by its character, which is the result of historical development. The earliest surviving manifestations of art are not the most authentic, nor do they in any way circumscribe art's range. And rather than best exemplifying what art is, they make it more obscure. It needs to be taken into account that the oldest surviving art, the cave paintings, belongs as a whole to the visual domain. Next to nothing is known of the music or poetry of the epoch. There are no indications of anything prehistoric that may have differed qualitatively from the optical works. Among aestheticians, Croce was probably the first to condemn, in Hegelian spirit, the question of the historical origin of art as aesthetically irrelevant. Quote, "Since this spiritual activity is its history's object, the absurdity of propounding the historical problem of the origin of art becomes evident. If expression is a form of consciousness, how can one look for the historical origin of what is not a product of nature and is presupposed by human history? How can one assign a historical genesis to a thing that is a category by means of which all historical processes and facts are understood?" End quote. However correct the intention may be not to confound what is oldest with the concept of the thing in itself, which only becomes what it is in the first place through its development, Croce's argumentation is dubious. By simply identifying art with expression, which is presupposed by human history, he once again defines art as what it should never be for the philosophy of history, a category, an invariant form of consciousness, something that is static in form, even if Croce conceives it as pure activity or spontaneity. His idealism, no less than the Bergsonian streak in his aesthetics, keeps him from being able to perceive the constitutive relation of art to what it itself is not, to what is not the pure spontaneity of the subject. This fundamentally limits his critique of the question of origin. Still, the legion of empirical studies that have since been dedicated to the question hardly give rise to revise Croce's verdict. It would be too easy to blame this on the advancing positivism that, out of fear of being contradicted by any next fact, no longer dares to undertake the construction of univocal theory and mobilizes the accumulation of facts in order to prove that genuine science can no longer put up with theory on a grand scale. Ethnology in particular, which according to the current division of labor has the responsibility of interpreting prehistoric findings, has let itself be intimidated by the tendency stretching back to Frobenius to explicate everything archaically puzzling in terms of religion, even when the findings themselves contradict such summary treatment. Nevertheless, the scientific exclusion of the question of origin, which corresponds to the philosophical critique of origin, testifies to something more than the powerlessness of science and the terror of positivistic taboos. Melville J. Hershkowitz's study, Man and His Work, is characteristic of the interpretive pluralism that even a disillusioned science is unable to renounce. If contemporary science renounces any monistic answer to the question of the origin of art, the question of what art originally was and has remained ever since, it thereby discloses an element of truth. Art did not become a unified whole until a very late stage. There is reason to doubt whether such integration is not more that of the concept than that of what it claims to comprehend. The forced quality of the term Sprachkunstwerk, the linguistic artwork, now popular among Germanists, awakens suspicion by its unceremonial subsumption of poetry to art through the mediation of language, even though art unquestionably became unified in the course of the process of enlightenment. The most archaic artistic manifestations are so diffuse that it is as difficult as it is vain to try to decide what once did and did not count as art. In later stages as well, art consistently resisted the process of unification in which it was simultaneously caught up. Its own concept is not indifferent to this. What seems to grow hazy in the half-light of prehistory is vague not only because of its distance, but because it regards something of the indeterminate, of what is inadequate to the concept, which progressive integration tirelessly menaces. It is perhaps not irrelevant that the oldest cave paintings, whose naturalism is always so readily affirmed, demonstrated the greatest fidelity to the portrayal of movement, as if they already aspired to what Valéry ultimately demanded, the painstaking imitation of the indeterminate, of what has not been nailed down. If so, the impulse of these paintings was not naturalistic imitation, but rather, from the beginning, a protest against reification. Blame for ambiguity is not, or not only, to be ascribed to the limitedness of knowledge, but is characteristic of prehistory itself. Univocity exists only since the emergence of subjectivity. The so-called problem of origin echoes in the controversy over whether naturalistic depiction or symbolic geometrical forms came first. Implicit in this question is the hope that it will provide what is needed to discern the primordial essence of art. This hope is deceptive. Arnold Hauser opens his Social History of Art with the thesis that during the Paleolithic age, naturalism was older. Quote, "The monuments of primitive art clearly suggest that naturalism has the prior claim, so that it is becoming more and more difficult to maintain the theory of the primacy of an art remote from life and nature, end quote. The polemical overtone against the neo-romantic doctrine of the religious origin of art is unmistakable. Yet this important historian straightaway restricts the thesis of the priority of naturalism. Hauser, while still employing the two habitually contrasting theses, criticizes them as anachronistic. Quote, "The dualism of the visible and the invisible, of the seen and the merely known, remains absolutely foreign to Paleolithic art," end quote. The dualism of the visible and the invisible, the seen and the merely known, remains absolutely foreign to Paleolithic art. He recognizes the element of undifferentiatedness from reality in the earliest art, as well as the undifferentiatedness from reality of the sphere of semblance. Hauser maintains something akin to the priority of naturalism on the basis of a theory of magic that asserts the reciprocal dependence of the similar. For him, similarity is effectively replicability, and it exercises practical magic. Accordingly, Hauser divides magic sharply from religion, the former exclusively serving to procure means of sustenance. This sharp division is obviously hard to reconcile with the theorem of primordial undifferentiatedness. On the other hand, it helps to establish replication as fundamental, even though other scholars, such as Erich Holm, contest the hypothesis of the utilitarian magical function of the replica. Hauser, by contrast, contends that, quote, "the Paleolithic hunter and painter thought he was in possession of the thing itself in the picture, thought he had one power over the portrayed by the portrayal," end quote. With certain reservations, Resch also tends toward this position. On the other hand, Katissa Schlosser finds that the most striking characteristic of Paleolithic portrayal is the deviation from the natural image. This deviation, however, is not attributed to any archaic irrationalism, but rather, following Lorenz and Galen, is interpreted as an expressive form of a biological ratio. Clearly, the thesis of magical utilitarianism and naturalism stands up in the face of the evidence no more than does Holmes' thesis of the religious origin of art. His explicit use of the concept of symbolization already postulates for the earliest period a dualism that Hauser first attributes to the Neolithic period. This dualism, according to Holm, serves a unitary organization of art, just as within this dualism there appears the structure of an articulated and therefore necessarily hierarchical and institutionalized society, one in which production already plays a role. He argues that cult and a unitary canon of forms were established during the same period, and that art was thus divided into a sacred and a profane sphere, that is, into idol sculpture and decorative ceramics. This construction of the animistic phase is paralleled by the construction of pre-animism, or as science today prefers to call it, the non-empirical worldview, which is marked by the essential unity of all life. But the objective impenetrability of the oldest phenomena rebuffs this construction. A concept like the essential unity of all life already presupposes a division between form and material in the earliest phase, or, at the least, oscillates between the idea of such a division and the idea of unity. The stumbling block here is the concept of unity. Its current use obscures everything, including the relation between the one and the many. In truth, unity should be conceived as it was reflected upon for the first time in Plato's Parmenides, as the unity of the many. The undifferentiated character of prehistory is not a unity of this sort, but falls rather on the other side of the dichotomy in which unity has meaning only as a polarity. As a result, such investigations as Fritz Krauss's Masks and Ancestral Figures also encounters difficulties. According to Krauss, in the oldest non-animistic representations, form is bound up with the material rather than being separable from it. Any change of the essence is possible only through a change in material and form, that is, through the complete transformation of the body. This explains the metamorphosis of essences into one another. Krauss rightly argues against the conventional concept of the symbol that the transformation that takes place in mass ceremonies is not symbolic but rather formative magic, a term borrowed from the developmental psychologist Heinz Werner. For the Indians, he claims, the mask is not simply the demon whose force is transferred to its bearer. Rather, the bearer himself becomes the incarnation of the demon and is extinguished as itself. There are grounds for doubting this. Every member of a tribe, the mask included, clearly recognizes the difference between his own face and the mask, a difference that, according to the neo-romantic construction, should be imperceptible. Face and mask are no more one and the same than the bearer of the mask can be taken for the incarnation of the demon. Contrary to Crass's claim, the element of dissimulation inheres in the phenomenon. Neither the often totally stylized form nor the fact that the bearer of the mask is only partially covered affects the interpretation of the essential transformation of the bearer of the mask. Something on the order of belief in real transformation is of course equally part of the phenomenon in just the same way that children playing do not distinguish sharply between themselves and the role played, yet can at any moment be called back to reality. Even expression is hardly primordial. It too developed historically, perhaps from animism. When a clan member imitatively makes himself into a totemic animal or a fearful divinity, something other than the self-contained individual is expressed. Although expression is seemingly an aspect of subjectivity, in it, externalization, there dwells just as much that is not the self, that probably is the collective. In that the subject, awakening to expression, seeks collective sanction, expression is already evidence of a fissure. It is only with the stabilization of the subject in self-consciousness that expression becomes autonomous as the expression of the subject, while maintaining the gesture of making itself into something. Replication could be interpreted as the reification of this comportment, and it is thus the enemy of precisely that impulse that is rudimentarily objectivated as expression. At the same time, such reification by means of replication is also emancipatory. It helps to free expression by placing it at the disposal of the subject. Once people were bound as expressionless as animals, who neither laugh nor cry, though their shapes are objectively expressive, something the animals probably do not sense. This is recalled first by gorilla-like masks, later by artworks. Expression, art's quasi-natural element, is as such already something other than pure nature. Interesting. The extremely heterogeneous interpretations are made possible by an objective ambiguity. Even the claim that heterogeneous elements are intermeshed in prehistoric artistic phenomena is anachronistic. It is more likely that division and unity arose under the pressure to be freed from the spell of the diffuse, accompanied by the emergence of a more secure social organization. In his conspectus, Herskovits coherently argues that developmental theories that deduce art from a primarily symbolical or realistic principle of validity are untenable given the contradictory diversity of prehistoric and primitive art. The sharp contrast drawn between primitive conventionalism in the sense of stylization and Paleolithic realism isolates a single aspect. It is not possible to discern the general preponderance of one principle over another in earliest times any more than this could be done today among surviving primitive peoples. Paleolithic sculpture is said to be, for the most part, highly stylized, contrary to the contemporary realistic portrayals of the cave paintings. This realism, however, as Herskovits points out, is marked by heterogeneous elements, foreshortenings, for example, that cannot be interpreted as being perspectival or symbolic. The art of primitive people today is just as complex. Realistic elements have in no way suppressed fully stylized forms, least of all in sculpture. Immersion in art's origins tantalizes aesthetic theory with various, apparently typical procedures, but just as quickly they escape the firm grip that modern interpretational consciousness imagines it possesses. Art anterior to the Paleolithic period is not known, but it is doubtless that art did not begin with works, whether they were primarily magical or already aesthetic. The cave drawings are stages of a process and in no way an early one. The first images must have been preceded by a mimetic comportment, the assimilation of the self to its other, that does not fully coincide with the superstition of direct magical influence. If in fact no differentiation between magic and mimesis had been prepared over a long period of time, the striking traces of autonomous elaboration in the cave paintings would be inexplicable. But once aesthetic comportment, prior to all objectivation, set itself off from magical practices, however rudimentarily, this distinction has since been carried along as a residue. It is as if the now functionless mimesis, which reaches back into the biological dimension, was vestigially maintained, foreshadowing the maxim that the superstructure is transformed more slowly than the infrastructure. In the traces of what has been overtaken by the general course of things, all art bears the suspicious burden of what did not make the grade, the regressive. But aesthetic comportment is not altogether rudimentary, an irrevocable necessity of art and preserved by it. Aesthetic comportment contains what has been belligerently excised from civilization and repressed, as well as the human suffering under the loss, a suffering already expressed in the earliest forms of mimesis. This element should not be dismissed as irrational. Art is, in its most ancient relics, too deeply permeated with rationality. The obstinacy of aesthetic comportment, which was later ideologically glorified as the eternal natural power of the play drive, testifies rather than to this day no rationality has been fully rational. None has unrestrictedly benefited humanity, its potential, or even a humanized nature. What marks aesthetic comportment as irrational according to the criteria of dominant rationality is that art denounces the particular essence of a ratio that pursues means rather than ends. Art reminds us of the latter and of an objectivity freed from the categorical structure. This is the source of art's rationality, its character as knowledge. Aesthetic comportment is the capacity to perceive more in things than they are. It is the gaze under which the given is transformed into an image. Whereas this comportment can be effortlessly impugned as inadequate by the status quo, the latter can indeed only be experienced through this comportment. A final intimation of the rationality in mimesis is imparted by Plato's doctrine of enthusiasm as the precondition of philosophy and emphatic knowledge, which he has not only demanded on a theoretical level, but demonstrated at the decisive point in the Phaedrus. This Platonic doctrine has degenerated into a cultural commodity, yet without forfeiting its truth content. Aesthetic comportment is the unimpaired corrective of reified consciousness that has, in the meantime, burgeoned as totality. That which in aesthetic comportment propels itself toward the light and seeks to escape the spell manifests itself e contrario in those who do without it, the aesthetically insensible. To study them would be of inestimable value for the analysis of aesthetic comportment. Even in terms of the standards of the dominant rationality, they are in no way the most progressive or developed, nor are they simply those who lack a particular expendable quality. On the contrary, their entire constitution is deformed to a pathological degree. They concretize. Those whose thought is no more than projection are fools, which artists must not be on any account. Those, however, who do not project at all fail to grasp reality and instead repeat and falsify it by crushing out what glimmered, however distantly, to pre-animistic consciousness, the communication of all dispersed particulars with each other. This consciousness is no more true than one that confused fantasy and reality. Comprehension occurs only when the concept transcends what it wants to grasp. Art puts this to the test. Thinking that proscribes such comprehension becomes outright stupidity and misses the object because it subjugates it. Art legitimates itself within the confines of the spell, and that rationality becomes powerless when aesthetic comportment is repressed, or under the pressure of socialization, no longer even constituted. As was already pointed out in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, strict positivism crosses over into the feeble-mindedness of the artistically insensible, the successfully castrated. the narrow-minded wisdom that sorts out feeling from knowing and rubs its hands together when it finds the two balanced is, as trivialities sometimes are, the caricature of a situation that over the centuries of the division of labor has inscribed this division in subjectivity. Yet feeling and understanding are not absolutely different in the human disposition and remain dependent even in their dividedness. The forms of reaction that are subsumed under the concept of feeling become futile enclaves of sentimentality as soon as they seal themselves off from their relation to thought and turn a blind eye toward truth. Thought, however, approaches tautology when it shrinks from the sublimation of the mimetic comportment. The fatal separation of the two came about historically and is revocable. Ratio without mimesis is self-negating. Ends, the raison d'être of raison, are qualitative, and mimetic power is effectively the power of qualitative distinction. The self-negation of reason clearly has its historical necessity. The world, which is objectively losing its openness, no longer has need of a spirit that is defined by its openness. Indeed, it can scarcely put up with the traces of that spirit. With regard to its subjective side, the contemporary loss of experience may largely coincide with the bitter repression of mimesis that takes the place of its metamorphosis. What in various sectors of German ideology is still called an artistic sensibility is just this repression of mimesis raised to a principle, as which it is transformed into artistic insensibility. Aesthetic comportment, however, is neither immediately mimesis nor its repression, but rather the process that mimesis sets in motion and in which, modified, mimesis is preserved. This process transpires equally in the relation of the individual to art as in the historical macrocosm. It congeals in the immanent movement of each and every artwork, in its tensions and in their possible resolution. Ultimately, aesthetic comportment is to be defined as the capacity to shudder, as if goosebumps were the first aesthetic image. What later came to be called subjectivity, freeing itself from the blind anxiety of the shudder, is at the same time the shudder's own development. Life in the subject is nothing but what shudders, the reaction to the total spell that transcends the spell. Consciousness without shudder is reified consciousness. That shudder in which subjectivity stirs without yet being subjectivity is the act of being touched by the other. Aesthetic comportment assimilates itself to that other rather than subordinating it. Such a constitutive relation of the subject to objectivity and aesthetic comportment joins eros and knowledge. All right. Now we're on the draft introduction. The concept of philosophical aesthetics has an antiquated quality, as does the concept of a system or that of morals. This feeling is in no way restricted to artistic praxis and the public indifference to aesthetic theory. Even in academic circles, essays relevant to aesthetics have for decades now noticeably diminished. This point is made in a recent dictionary of philosophy. Quote, there is scarcely another philosophical discipline that rests on such flimsy presuppositions as does aesthetics. Like a weather vane, it is blown about by every philosophical, cultural, and scientific gust. At one moment it is metaphysical, and in the next empirical, now normative, then descriptive, now defined by artists, then by connoisseurs. One day art is supposedly the center of aesthetics and natural beauty merely preliminary. The next day art beauty is merely second-hand natural beauty. Moritz Geiger's description of the dilemma of aesthetics has been true since the middle of the 19th century. There is a double reason for this pluralism of aesthetic theories, which are often even left unfinished. It resides, on the one hand, in the fundamental difficulty, indeed impossibility, of gaining general access to art by means of a system of philosophical categories, and on the other, in the fact that aesthetic statements have traditionally presupposed theories of knowledge. The problematic of theories of knowledge returns directly in aesthetics, because how aesthetics interprets its objects depends on the concept of the object held by the theory of knowledge. This traditional dependency, however, is defined by the subject matter itself and is already contained in the terminology. End quote. Although this well describes the situation, it does not sufficiently explain it. The other philosophical disciplines, including the theory of knowledge and logic, are no less controversial, and yet interest in them has not flagged to a similar extent. The unusual situation of aesthetics is discouraging. Grosset introduced radical nominalism into aesthetic theory. Almost simultaneously, important thinking left behind the so-called fundamental problems of aesthetics and became immersed in specific formal and material problems, as is the case with Lukács's theory of the novel, Benjamin's critique of elective affinities, which developed into an emphatic treatise, and his Origin of German Tragic Drama. The last-named work cunningly defends Croce's nominalism, yet at the same time takes into account a situation where consciousness no longer hopes that fundamental principles will lead to insight into the traditionally great questions of aesthetics, especially those of a metaphysical dimension, but instead seeks insight in spheres that formerly held the status of exempla. Philosophical aesthetics found itself confronted with the fatal alternative between dumb and trivial universality on the one hand, and, on the other, arbitrary judgments usually derived from conventional opinions. Hegel's program that thought should not proceed from above but rather relinquish itself to the phenomena was first brought within reach in aesthetics by a nominalism in opposition to which Hegel's own aesthetics, given its classicist components, preserved far more abstract invariance than was coherent with a dialectical method. This at the same time threw into question the possibility of aesthetic theory as a traditional theory. For the idea of the concrete, on which each and every artwork, indeed any experience of beauty, is fixed, prohibits, similarly as in the study of art, distancing itself from determinate phenomena in the way that philosophical consensus had so long and falsely supposed possible in the spheres of the theory of knowledge or ethics. A general theory of the aesthetically concrete would necessarily let slip what interested it in the object in the first place. The reason for the obsolescence of aesthetics is that it scarcely ever confronted itself with its object. By its very form, aesthetics seems sworn to a universality that culminates in inadequacy to the artworks and complementarily in transitory eternal values. The academic mistrust of aesthetics is founded in the academicism immanent to it. The motive for the lack of interest in aesthetic questions is primarily the institutionalized scientific, scholarly anxiety vis-à-vis what is uncertain and contested, not fear of provincialism and of how backward the formulation of issues is with respect to the nature of those issues. The synoptical, contemplative perspective that science expects of aesthetics has meanwhile become incompatible with progressive art, which, as in Kafka, has lost patience with any contemplative attitude. Aesthetics today, therefore, begins by diverging from what it treats, having become suspicious of the passive, possibly even culinary, pleasures of spectators. As its standard, contemplative aesthetics presupposes that taste by which the observer disposes over the artworks from a distance. Taste, on account of its subjective prejudice, itself stands in need of theoretical reflection not only as to why it fails in the face of the most recent modernism, but why it may long have been inadequate to advanced art. This critique was anticipated by Hegel's demand that the work itself take the place of the judgment of taste. Yet in his own aesthetics, the object did not extricate itself from the perspective, still matted together with taste, of the detached spectator. It was this system that enabled his thought to be fruitful even where it remained at all too great a distance from its objects. Hegel and Kant were the last who, to put it bluntly, were able to write major aesthetics without understanding anything about art. That was possible so long as art itself was oriented to encompassing norms that were not questioned in individual works and were liquefied only in the work's immanent problematic. True, there has probably scarcely ever been a work that was important in any regard that did not, by virtue of its own form, mediate these norms and thus virtually transform them. Yet these norms were not simply liquidated. Something of them towered over and above the individual works. The great philosophical aesthetics stood in concordance with art to the extent that they conceptualized what was evidently universal in it. This was in accordance with the stage in which philosophy and other forms of spirit, such as art, had not yet been torn apart. Because the same spirit ruled in philosophy and art, philosophy was able to treat art in a substantial fashion without surrendering itself to the works. Certainly, artworks regularly succumb to the effort, motivated by the non-identity of art with its universal determinations, to conceive them in their specificity. This resulted in speculative idealism's most painfully mistaken judgments. Kant, who was not pledged to prove that a posteriori was the a priori, was precisely for this reason less fallible. Imprisoned by 18th century art, which he would not have hesitated to call pre-critical, that is, preceding the full emancipation of the subject, he did not compromise himself to the same extent as Hegel by art-alien assertions. He even accorded more space to later radical modern possibilities than did Hegel, who confronted art so much more courageously. After them came the sensitive connoisseurs, who occupied the mediocre middle ground between the thing itself as postulated by Hegel and the concept. They combined a culinary relation to art with an incapacity for philosophical construction. Georg Simmel was typical of such sensitivity, despite his decisive predilection for the aesthetically individual. The right medium for understanding art is either the unwavering asceticism of conceptualization, doggedly refusing to allow itself to be irritated by facts, or the unconscious consciousness in the midst of the work itself. Art is never understood by the appreciative, snugly emphatic spectator. The capriciousness of such an attitude is from the beginning indifferent to what is essential to works, their binding force. Aesthetics was productive only so long as it undiminishably respected the distance from the empirical and with windowless thoughts penetrated into the content of its other, or when, with a closeness bordering on embodiment, it judged the work from within, as sometimes occurs in the scattered remarks of individual artists, which are important not as the expression of a personality that is hardly authoritative with regard to the work, but because often, without recurring to the subject, they document something of the experiential force of the work. These reports are often constrained by the naivete that society insists on finding in art. Artists either stubbornly resist aesthetics with artisanal rancor, or the anti-dilettantes devise dilettantic theories that make do. If their comments are to convey anything to aesthetics, they require interpretation, artisanal instruction that wants polemically to usurp the position of aesthetics ultimately develops into positivism, even when it includes sympathy with metaphysics. Advice on how best to compose a rondo is useless as soon as there are reasons of which artisanal instruction is ignorant, why rondos can no longer be written. Its general rules are in need of philosophical development if they are to be more than a decoction of conventions. Decoction. When they balk at this transition, they almost inevitably seek succor in a murky Weltanschauung. After the demise of idealistic systems, the difficulty of an aesthetics that would be more than a desperately reanimated branch of philosophy is that of bringing the artist's closeness to the phenomena into conjunction with a conceptual capacity free of any subordinating concept, free of all decreed judgments. Committed to the medium of concepts, such an aesthetics would go beyond a mere phenomenology of artworks. On the other hand, the effort, under the pressure of the nominalistic situation, to make a transition to what has been called an empirical aesthetics is in vain. If, for example, in compliance with the prescript of such scientization, one wanted to reach general aesthetic norms by abstracting from empirical descriptions and classifying them, the results would be incomparably meager when compared with the substantive and incisive categories of the speculative systems. Applied to current artistic practice, such distillates would be no more appropriate than artistic ideals ever were. All aesthetic questions terminate in those of the truth content of artworks. Is the spirit that a work objectively bears in its specific form true? For empiricism, this is, as superstition, anathema. For it, artworks are bundles of indeterminate stimuli. What they are in themselves is beyond judgment. Any claim to know is a projection. Only subjective reactions to artworks can be observed, measured, and generalized. As a result, the actual object of aesthetics escapes study. It is replaced by what is at bottom a pre-aesthetic sphere that has proved to be socially that of the culture industry. Hegel's achievement is not criticized in the name of a purportedly greater scientific acumen, but is instead forgotten in favor of vulgar adaptation. That empiricism recoils from art, of which in general it has hardly ever taken notice, with the exception of the unique and truly free John Dewey, other than insofar as it attributes all knowledge that does not agree with its rules of the game to be poetry, can be explained by the fact that art constitutively dismisses these rules of the game, because art is an entity that is not identical with its imperia. What is essential to art is that which in it is not the case, that which is incommensurable with the empirical measure of all things. The compulsion to aesthetics is the need to think this empirical incommensurability. The objective difficulties in this are compounded subjectively by broad resistance. For most people, aesthetics is superfluous. It disturbs the weekend pleasures to which art has been consigned as the complement to bourgeois routine. In spite of far-reaching alienness to art, this subjective resistance helps give expression to something closely allied to art. For art allies itself with repressed and dominated nature in the progressively rationalized and integrated society. Yet industry makes even this resistance an institution and changes it into coin. It cultivates art as a natural reserve for irrationalism, from which thought is to be excluded. It thereby allies itself with the platitude, a Bowdlerized theorem of aesthetics, that art must be a direct object of pleasure, whereas instead art at every point participates in concepts. This fundamentally confuses the ever-problematic primacy of intuition in art with the enjoinder that art not be thought about because successful artists themselves supposedly never did so. The result of this mentality is a bloated concept of naivete. In the domain of pure feeling, the phrase appears in the title of the aesthetics of a preeminent neo-Kantian. A taboo is placed on anything akin to logicality, in spite of the elements of stringency in the artwork, whose relation to extra-aesthetic logic and causality could be elucidated only by philosophical aesthetics. Feeling thus becomes its own opposite. It is reified. Art is actually the world once over, as like it as it is unlike it. In the managed world of the culture industry, aesthetic naivete has changed its function. What once was praise of artworks, when they were poised on the pedestal of their classicality as their abiding quality, that of noble simplicity, has become an exploitable means for attracting customers. The consumers, whose naivete is confirmed and drilled into them, are to be dissuaded from entertaining stupid ideas about what has been unpacked into the pills they are obliged to swallow down. The simplicity of times past is translated into the stupidity of the culture consumer who, gratefully and with a metaphysically clear conscience, buys up the industry's trash, which is in any case inescapable. As soon as naivete is taken up as a point of view, it no longer exists. A genuine relation between art and consciousness's experience of it would consist in education, which schools opposition to art as a consumer product as much as it allows the recipient a substantial idea of what an artwork is. Art today, even among those who produce it, is largely cut off from such education. The price art pays for this is the permanent temptation of the subartistic, even in the range of the most refined techniques. The naivete of artists has degenerated into naive pliancy vis-a-vis the culture industry. Naivete was never the natural essence of the artist, but rather the self-evidence with which he conducted himself in an imposed social situation. That is, it was an aspect of conformism. The unqualified acceptance of social forms was the real criterion of artistic naivete. The justification of naivete is bound up with the extent to which the subject assents to or resists these forms, the extent to which these forms can still lay claim to self-evidence. Ever since the surface of life, the immediacy it makes available to people, has become ideology, naivete has reversed into its own opposite. It has become the reflex of reified consciousness to a reified world. Artistic production that refuses to relinquish the impulse against the ossification of life and is thus truly naive becomes what, according to the game rules of conventional society, is the opposite of naivete. Admittedly, it has stored up in it as much naivete as the comportment of art has of non-compliance with the reality principle, something of the childish and, according to social norms, the infantile. It is the opposite of established naivete, and it is condemned. Hegel, and even more perspicaciously, Carl Gustav Jochmann, knew this. But they were compelled to understand it in the context of their classicism, and so attributed the end of art to it. Art's naive and reflexive elements have, in truth, always been much more internal to each other than the longing that arose during the rise of industrial capitalism wanted to recognize. The history of art since Hegel has shown up what was mistaken in his premature eschatology of art. Its mistake was that it perpetuated the conventional ideal of naivete. Even Mozart, who played the role of the divinely gifted, capering prodigy in the bourgeois household, was, as every page of his correspondence with his father documents, incomparably more reflexive than the popular profile of him lets on. Reflexive, however, not in the sense of a freely hovering abstract intelligence, but in the compositional material itself. Just how much the work of another household divinity of pure intuition, Raphael, has reflection as its objective condition is evident in the geometrical organization of his paintings. Art without reflection is the retrospective fantasy of a reflexive age. Theoretical considerations and scientific findings have at all times been amalgamated with art, often as its bellwether, and the most important artists were not those who hesitated. Well-known instances of this are Piero della Francesca's discovery of aerial perspective and the aesthetic speculations of the Florentine Camerata, in which opera originated. The latter is paradigmatic of a form that, once it had become the darling of the public, was cloaked after the fact with the aura of a naivete, whereas it originates in theory, literally in an invention. Similarly, it was only the introduction of equal temperament in the 17th century that permitted modulation through the circle of fifths, and with it, Bach, who gratefully acknowledged this in the title of his great keyboard composition. Even in the 19th century, Impressionist technique in painting was based on the rightly or wrongly interpreted scientific analysis of retinal processes. Of course, the theoretical and reflexive elements in art seldom went untransformed. At times, art misunderstood the sciences to which it appealed, as is perhaps the case most recently with electronic music. Yet the productive impulse was little harmed by the rationality that was brought to bear on it. The physiological theorems of the Impressionists were probably foils for the in-part fascinated, in-part socially critical experiences of the metropolis and the dynamics of their paintings. By means of the discovery of a dynamic immanent to the reified world, they wanted to resist reification, which was most palpable in metropolitan life. In the 19th century, natural scientific explanations functioned as the self-unconscious agent of art. The basis of this affinity between art and science was that the ratio to which the most progressive art of the epoch reacted was none other than the ratio of the natural sciences. Whereas in the history of art, scientific theories tend to wither away. Without them, artistic practices would no more have developed than, inversely, these theorems can adequately explain such practices. This has consequences for reception. It is inadequate if it is less reflexive than the object it receives. Not knowing what one sees or hears bestows no privileged direct relation to works, but instead makes their perception impossible. Consciousness is not a layer in a hierarchy built over perception. Rather, all elements of aesthetic experience are reciprocal. No artwork consists in this superimposition of layers. That is exclusively the result of the calculation of the culture industry, that is, a result of reified consciousness. It can, for instance, be noted in extended, complex music that there is a constantly varying threshold between what is primarily perceived and what is determined by the reflexive perception of consciousness. The understanding of the meaning of a fleeting musical passage often depends on the intellective comprehension of its function in a whole that is not present. The purportedly immediate experience itself depends on what goes beyond pure immediacy. The ideal perception of artworks would be that in which what is mediated becomes immediate. Naivete is the goal, not the origin. Yet the flagging interest in aesthetics is not only predicated on aesthetics as a discipline, but equally, and indeed more so, on its object. Insofar as aesthetics concerns itself primarily with the how rather than with the fact of art, it seems silently to imply the possibility of art. This position has become uncertain. Aesthetics can no longer take the fact of art for granted in the way that Kant's theory of knowledge presupposed the mathematical natural sciences. Although traditional Although traditional theory was in no way encumbered by such concerns, aesthetic theory cannot escape the reality that art that holds fast to its concept and refuses consumption becomes anti-art, and that art's distress with itself, following the real catastrophes and faced with the coming ones, stands stands in moral disproportion to its continued existence. At its Hegelian zenith, philosophical aesthetics prognosticated the end of art. Although aesthetics later forgot this, art senses it all the more deeply. Even if art remained what it once was and can no longer remain, it would become something wholly different in the society that is emerging and by virtue of its changed function in that society. Artistic consciousness rightly mistrusts reflection, that by its very topic and by the style expected of it, disports itself as if a firm foundation existed, whereas it is retrospectively dubious that any such solid foundation ever existed. It was and was not already that ideology into which the contemporary cultural bustle, along with its art department, is clearly being transformed. Just gonna be right back. question of the possibility of art is so relevant that it has taken a form that mocks its putatively more radical formulation of whether and how art is even possible at all. The question has instead become that of the concrete possibility of art today. The uneasiness with art is not only that of a stagnating social consciousness vis-a-vis the modern. At every point, this uneasiness extends to what is essential to art, to its most advanced works. Art, for its part, seeks refuge in its own negation, hoping to survive through its death. This contemporary theater turns against the status of being a plaything, a peep show with glitter, against imitating the world even with sets strung with barbed wire. The pure mimetic impulse, the happiness of producing the world once over, which animates art and has stood in age-old tension with its anti-mythological enlightening component, has become unbearable under the system of total functional rationality. Art and happiness both arouse the suspicion of infantilism, although the anxiety that such infantilism inspires is itself regression, the misconstrual of the raison d'etre of all rationality. For the movement of the principle of self-preservation, to the extent that it is not fetishized, leads by its own forces to the desideratum of happiness. Nothing stronger speaks for art. In the contemporary novel, the impulses against the fiction of the constant presence of the narrator participates in art's self-disgust. This has in large measure defined the history of narration since Proust, though the genre has been unable to shake off completely the rubric fiction, which stands at the head of the bestseller lists, however much aesthetic semblance has become social anathema. Music struggles to free itself of the element by which Benjamin, somewhat over-generously, defined all art prior to the age of its technical reproducibility. Aura, the sorcery that emanates from music, even if it were anti-music, whenever it commences to sound. Yet art does not labor on traits of this sort as it does on correctable residues of its past, for these traits become inextricable grown together with art's own concepts. The more, however, art itself, in order not to barter away semblance for lies, is driven to reflect on its own presuppositions and when possible to absorb into its own form such reflections as if it were a counterpoison, the more skeptical it becomes towards the presumption of having self-consciousness imposed on it externally. Aesthetics is compelled to drag its own concepts helplessly behind a situation of art in which art, indifferent to what becomes of it, seeks to undermine those concepts without which it can hardly be conceived. No theory, aesthetic theory included, can dispense with the element of universality. This tempts aesthetics to take the side of invariance of precisely the sort that emphatic modern art must attack. The mania of cultural studies for reducing the new to the ever same, as for example the claim that surrealism is a form of mannerism, the lack of any sense for the historical situation of artistic phenomena as the index of their truth, corresponds to the tendency of philosophical aesthetics toward those abstract rules in which nothing is invariant other than that they are ever and again given the lie by spirit as it takes shape. What sets itself up as an eternal aesthetic norm is something that develops and is transient. The claim to imperishability has become obsolete. Even a university-certified schoolmaster would hesitate to apply to prose such as Kafka's Metamorphosis or The Penal Colony, in which the secure aesthetic distance to the object is shockingly undermined. A sanctioned criterion such as that of disinterested satisfaction, the greatness of Kafka's writing, must sense how awkwardly inapplicable to any talk of art is. The situation is no different in the case of a priori genres such as the tragic or comic in contemporary drama, however much contemporary works may be marbled by them in a way that the enormous apartment building in Kafka's Parable is marbled with medieval ruins. Although Beckett's plays can no longer be taken for tragic or comic, they are not, therefore, as would suit academic aesthetics, hybrids on the order of tragicomedy. On the contrary, Beckett's plays pass historical judgment over these categories as such, faithful to the historical innovation that there is no more laughing over the classics of comic theater except in a state of renewed barbarism. In accord with the tendency of modern art to make its own categories thematic through self-reflection, plays like Godot and Endgame, in a scene in which the protagonists decide to laugh, are more the tragic presentation of comedy's fate than they are comic. In the actor's forced laughter, the spectator's mirth vanishes. In the century already, the Vatican named a pièce à clef, whose target was the publisher of Simplicissimus's A Satire on Satire. Academic philosophers adopt a false superiority when they survey the history of art to procure for themselves the satisfaction of nil admirari and, living in the domestic company of eternal values, derive from the ever-sameness of things the profit of separating out what is truly different and endangers the status quo, in order to dismiss it as a rehashing of the classics. This attitude is in league with a socio-psychologically and institutionally reactionary attitude. It is only in the process of critical self-consciousness that aesthetics is able once again to reach art, if it was ever capable of this in the first place. All right. That's it for now. Catch you next time.